Bismillah ar-Rahman ar-Rahim. Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh, everyone. So we are going, alhamdulillah, doing on and off, but inshallah, Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala was right after when it talked about Prophet Hud. So there's Prophet Hud in that yellow, and that in the light yellow it was Prophet Salih alayhi salam, and then it moved on to talk about how they dealt with that da'wah and how they rejected the da'wah and the ending of it. And there are different patterns that we talked about. So the Prophet's da'wah, the way they did it, and how it lays out. So the ayat would lay out how the Prophet's da'wah was, what they did the da'wah to, what the message was, and how they reacted to it, and the result in where Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, how Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala punished them. So that was the pattern in those different ayat. But I want you guys to recognize something else here. So I want you to look at, if you look at the ayat, so you could see that Prophet Nuh alayhi salam was the beginning of this. Prophet Adam was really telling us about, our existence. The Prophet Adam, the way he related with Iblis, how he ate from the tree, and then it moves on to tell us that other pattern of how people related to the da'wah. And I want you to see one thing. Just today, as I was actually going through the ayat, you could see that there is that pattern. So first it was our existence with Prophet Adam. Then it talked about how the change happened during the time of Prophet Nuh, and people, again, with the deen, with their understanding of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, how they were putting in a narrative to why and how they made up a good, or at least to them, a good narrative to worship the idols. And then it continued to focus still on that aqidah part, which is the aqidah part in where the relationship, because we could see that with Prophet Nuh, Prophet Hud, Prophet Salih, how it was all Ya qawm i'budullah, Ya qawm i'budullah. But then there was this slight change in where, yes, it was telling us that they were accusing the prophets. So with Prophet Nuh, with Prophet Hud, with Prophet Salih, how they were accusing them of having some kind of a dalal, some kind of losing the logic of something, losing their intellect, losing their focus. So then we're talking about the deen and their loss of that connection with the main fitrah, with the main instinct that they were created in, and how later that actually takes us to that relationship. Well, let's look at Prophet Lut. Again, the stories of the prophets were actually in chronological order according to what we know. So Prophet Adam, then Nuh, then Hud, then from Hud, then Salih. So we could see that so far it's in chronological order, but that chronology is not only to tell us about the chronology, but is also taking us into a different realization in where when man, and this is not only in one place, but when man lost, at least, when people, the majority at least, had lost their understanding of what brings their existence into, or what makes the purpose of their existence, and when they lost their connection with the Lord Almighty, that's when they lost their connection with even their own intellect to understand what makes something right and wrong. That takes us from the deen, Then we go into yes, nafs, but then that's more related to their life preservance, etc. But then they lost their intellect, which takes us to category number 3 in that legal maxim in Islam. So let's lay it out forward right here, especially for those that are new to my system of always relating things. So let's see, it's the DNAIM. All right, so let's look at it. The deen, which is deen, your understanding of God, your understanding of the purpose of life. Then nafs, life preservance and quality of life, etc. We're talking about life and your health, etc. Then we look at the aql, which is mind. So we could see that the ayat were focusing on the deen and how they lost that connection with their understanding of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, and that is the main epistemology to understanding yourself. And then later they lost their connection and they thought that they were having that intellect to understand, and that's why they were accusing Prophet Nuh, Prophet Hud of being on dalal, or they said that he was trivial, or called the prophets trivial, or called them that they were losing their mind, they were in delusion. And then we could see that it took us into a different category in where it's talking about Prophet Lut. And when you look at Prophet Lut, it was actually talking about something that is related to chastity. It was talking about relating to reproduction, family. And it's really important to recognize that these categories, when one goes into that order of destructing their main perspective about their existence, about their purpose of life, then they're going to go and destruct their own existence and their own life, and then they're going to go into a destruction of what makes common sense, what makes logic, what makes a proper understanding of the reality around you. And then that will take the person into a different type of destruction, in where they're destructing certain certain parts of their life, which is what makes family. So once they destruct the understanding, then they start destructing their own selves. All right, so they destruct their understanding, then they start destructing their own selves, which is what comes in with ird. Destructing ird means destructing not only chastity. So when we're looking at reproduction in Islam, preserving reproduction to be between male and female and making family, that is actually in order to preserve mankind. Preserving mankind is part of preserving nature, is part of preserving your own self. So let's see. So then it takes us, and you'll see, by the way, how, and I'm gonna a little bit scroll the page, so let me just bring that one right here. And then if you look at, we're gonna jump really quick before we come back to it. Then we look at how the story after that talks about how Prophet Lut alayhi salam was dealing with the people that had destructed the DNA, in other words, the ird in that category. And we look at the mal, which is the M, and how they destructed that by actually destructing. Again, it then talks to us about how they destructed the fair distribution in wealth, which is economy and affecting economy. And that's why it's really important to remember that when we speak about DNAIM, sorry, I'm not sure why it brings that focal point right there, how when it talks about DNAIM, that is not whatsoever separated from the main focal point, which is your understanding of existence, your understanding of Allah, your relationship with Allah. So whatever kind of justice you want to bring about to mankind or the world, it actually starts with preserving the deen nafs, the deen first. So the first destruction really happened when people got away with the main understanding or the main epistemology, which actually starts from Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. So now you could see that the ayat, if we actually look at the ayat, now you could see how it actually takes us into a realization of when the understanding of Allah was distorted in their mind, that affected their mind to see in reality, to see in truth, to seeing how to look at patterns, and then they later affected their own life and their own connection, the dynamics of their own existence, the reproduction, and then not only the reproduction, but later it even affected the wealth distribution, it affected economy, and then that brings in that snowball that continues to totally deconstruct and destruct. So it's deconstructing and destructing. So deconstructing the way that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala created something brings in destruction. So that's why Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala punishes with destruction in order to bring back the construction that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala put in. Again, let's do it again. So when people deconstruct or attempt to deconstruct the construction that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala created in this world, whether that meant the purpose of life and what you were created for, or two, your understanding of true, in other words, the epistemological side of it, or three, then it goes into the dynamics, the social dynamics, the economical dynamics, all those different sides. So when the deconstruction takes place, in deconstructing what Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala had constructed in the creation of this world, that's when Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala will punish those that are making that deconstruction by destruction in order to continue the construction that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala had created in this world. So that's why you could see again, the DNAIM, which is the deen, the nas, the aql, the ird, the mal. So now that takes us to the third category, which is the story of Prophet Lut alayhi salam, and the third category in what they were trying to do. وَلُوطًا إِذْ قَالَ لِقَوْمِهِ. So after talking to us about deconstructing the perspective of the world, the perspective of the purpose of the world, the creation, and what the purpose of life, etc., and how the prophets dealt with that, then it takes us into how even the vision got into a different and a wrong, distorted image of what makes truth. Then it takes us into the implication of that. And the implication of it was on a social level and an economical level. And then he tells us, well, this is how it manifested in the stories of the following prophets. So, following prophet, in the way that it manifested on the social level. وَلُوطًا إِذْ قَالَ لِقَوْمِهِ. The story, وَلُوطًا, Prophet Lut. So notice that well right there in where it's taking us. Well, in addition to the previous stories, in addition to the stories that where you had seen how those patterns were taking place, let's go on with that category, and that's why that letter what is there, the letter what, and in other words, it's taking us in the same category, in the same pattern, in order for us to recognize it. إِذْ قَالَ لِقَوْمِهِ. So the word إِذْ is more of bringing about to our memory, in order to bring it to our recognition, in order to recall what happened. إِذْ قَالَ لِقَوْمِهِ. So when he told his قومه, and this is really important to say that إِذْ قَالَ لِقَوْمِهِ, it's very similar to when he called the prophets, the previous prophets, أَخَاهُمْ هُودَ, أَخَاهُمْ صَالِح, etc., their brother Hud, their brother Salih, etc. All right, إِذْ قَالَ لِقَوْمِهِ, when he told his people, so he was telling his people or tribe or nation, أَتَأْتُونَ الْفَاحِشَةَ, أَتَأْتُونَ, so this is more of, it's called istinkar. أَتَأْتُونَ الْفَاحِشَةَ, this is not seeking an answer, but this is more of an exclamation. Are you committing? أَتَأْتُونَ, the word يَأْتي or أَتَى means to bring into effect, or أَتَأْتِي or أَتَى. أَتَى could also mean to engage in something, to engage in something. So what were they engaging in? So the ayah says, do you engage? So are you engaging? There's more of a ta'ajjub or exclamation, or in disgust, to reflect disgust, or to reflect that this is more of a disliked matter. أتأتون الفاحشة. Do you engage in al-fahisha? Now I want you to look at the word al-fahisha, because al-fahisha in general, the word fahasha, so we're looking at the three root, fahasha means to commit a transgression. But when you put in the alif lam, this is like saying an ultimate transgression. So the al, again, the al can be ahdiya or can be istighraqiyya. What does that mean? So al-ahdiyya could be that you understand what I'm talking about, meaning that this is referring to a specific transgression that you and I understand what we're talking about. This could be the meaning of al. The other al, which is al-istighraqiyya, to mean ultimate, a comprehensive type of al, to mean the different types of evil actions. So let's see. Is this al necessarily the comprehensive al, or is this al the specifying al? Well, let's see how we can answer that question. Whenever you need answers, sometimes you need to move on with the clause in order to see what type of al this is. So, al-fahishata ma sabaqakum biha min ahadin min al-alamin. In other words, are you practicing? Let's just first use the literal meaning of it, which is the ultimate transgression, the ultimate act of evil, that no one or no other nation, this is min al-alamin, no other nation had come with such an action before you. Now, here's the thing. What is that action? Is it rape? Is it a different type of a transgression? What were they actually doing? So, this is really what is explained by the coming ayah, semicolon. Let's see what that semicolon is going to say. إِنَّكُمْ لَتَأْتُونَ الرِّجَالَ شَهْوَةً مِّن دُونِ النِّسَاءِ. Now, this is to explain what is referred to by al-fahisha. So, al-fahisha here so far is really not clear. What really is it referring to? What type of an ultimate transgression is it? What type of an illicit behavior is it? So far it's not clear. Until you come across this ayah in where it explained fully that this ultimate illicit transgression is so forth. إِنَّكُمْ لَتَأْتُونَ. You engage, لَتَأْتُونَ. So ata means to engage. And this is in order to tell us that al-fahisha is actually referring to what they were engaging in. This ultimate transgression, ultimate illicit behavior is in engaging in a specific manner. What specific manner is that? The specific manner is, again, it came with the same verb. إِنَّكُمْ لَتَأْتُونَ الرِّجَالِ. You commit, or in other words, you engage with men in lust and leaving out the women. This is the clearest word in making sure, in clearest terms, in the clearest ayat, that it is making sure that people understand that what Prophet Lut alayhi salam was forbidding on his nation to engage in is nothing but what we know today as gayism, which is men approaching men as if they approach women, in other words, approaching in a sexual manner. So that's what explains the word shahwa. The word shahwa would mean lust. In other words, they were practicing their their sexual lust fulfillment with men and not with women. In other words, it is referring to what you and I understand. بل أنتم قوم مسرفون. Verily, bal. The word bal is telling us this is word tufid al-idrab, which means it is confirming, and it is also rejecting what the other person was probably debating with that other person. So for example, you come to me and you say you were not fasting today, and I will say bal, verily I was. So this is to confirm I was, and also to reject what you had just claimed. So this is two things. The word bal is to reject what you had claimed, and it is also confirming what I am claiming or what I am saying. So here, bal antum qawmun musrifun, this is in order to say that there was a debate, but the Prophet Lut alayhi salam is saying bal antum, as a matter of fact, qawmun musrifun. Now what is al-musrif? Al-musrif is the person that puts an effort that is in the wrong place. So when, for example, when we talk about wealth, for example, you're probably using that wealth, if we're talking about wealth, using that wealth for issues that are trivial, for issues that don't belong in it. Again, here's the key word, that doesn't belong in it. You're putting an effort in where it doesn't belong. So if, for example, you're using wealth in buying items that are not worth it or that are not needed, then that is called israf. Same thing when we're talking about putting energy in where it does not belong. And of course we understand what it means to put energy where it does not belong. In this situation, putting that energy in where it does not belong is actually putting it in the wrong place. And that's why Prophet Lut alayhi salam is saying bal antum qawmun musrifun. So now we can see that Prophet Lut alayhi salam actually had emphasized, one, he called it al-fahisha. He called it the ultimate transgression. Ultimate, and the word fahisha, it doesn't only mean transgression, but it also means illicit. So an ultimate illicit transgression. And two, he explained it, this is unprecedented behavior. In other words, this is a total transgression even against the instinct. In other words, this is against even the foundation of mankind. And then called it musrifun. So three things just in these three lines of how disgusting or how rejected or how illicit and how the Lord Almighty regarded such a behavior as something that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala totally objects in Islam. وَمَا كَانَ جَوَابَ قَوْمِهِ. Now here let's see what the response was. وَمَا كَانَ جَوَابَ قَوْمِهِ. وَمَا كَانَ is actually telling us that the general, or at least the only response that his nation had given, إِلَّا أَنْ قَالُوا أَخْرِجُوهُمْ مِنْ قَرْيَتِكُمْ. And this is really important, you guys. This is exactly what we're living in today. What did they respond? إِلَّا أَنْ قَالُوا. They said, the إِلَّا أَنْ قَالُوا, their only, that is. So when we look at the word إِلَّا, in other words, their only response to all the different evidences and all the different objections that he was laying out in front of them, how this is not appropriate, this is illicit, this is not something that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala created this world in, etc. They just responded in one way. إِلَّا أَنْ قَالُوا أَخْرِجُوهُمْ مِنْ قَرْيَتِكُمْ. Expel them out of the country. Now I want you to look at this. Did they necessarily have a debate? Did they use logic? Did they use any type of trying to debate that it was right, that it was having any type of evidence to prove that it was appropriate in any way? No. What method did they use? They used the method of bringing and instilling fear. أخرجوهم من قريتكم. In other words, the only way was to accuse them of being homophobic. was to accuse them. Again, I'm assuming that this lecture today is definitely probably going to be taken out of YouTube, or probably even going to be canceling my whole YouTube channel. So hopefully, inshallah, I'll have backups. All right. لأن قالوا أخرجوهم من قريتكم. The way they responded, أخرجوهم من قريتكم. Expel them out of your city, or out of your village. The qarya is more of a village. So you could see that the narrative that they were using, or at least the system, the agenda that was being used, is really very similar to today. You either agree with us, or you're going to be ostracized, if not even expelled out of the country, or if not even, let's continue. إنهم أناس يتطهرون. What was their crime? The crime that they were committing, إنهم أناس يتطهرون. That was their explanation. Their explanation, these people are seeking purification. Wait a minute. Purification is a crime? Well, according to them, because again, remember that DNAIM, so once you've got your main tool for thought is distorted, if the tool of thought is distorted, well, that's going to bring in all the different answers wrong. So just like in math, if the beginning of your problem solving is wrong, well, definitely the result is going to be wrong, and that's the way it goes. So if the main method is wrong in understanding right, wrong, or in defining truth, if the tool that you're using is wrong, the result is going to be wrong regardless. And that's the same thing. Now, إِنَّهُمْ أُنَاسٌ يَتَطَهَّرُونَ is telling us that their mind distorted all the different process, the different thought in how they could relate to this behavior and how they could prove it right or wrong. But in the end, their mind was so focused on that illicit behavior that they even started seeing what is normally and amongst human and part of human nature to see purification as something that is good. But they started seeing purity and purification as a crime in itself. And they, in other words, they were laying out a different narrative. They're people seeking purification. But that's supposed to be an honor, not a dishonor. But that they even started seeing what is supposed to be an honor as a dishonor, and will even say it straightforward. Very similar to today, just by seeking purification, seeking modesty, seeking religiosity, seeking truth. You're going to be labeled with all these labels in order to make sure that you are afraid. And again, the word is afraid to say the truth, because the second that you are not afraid, then your da'wah is to instill fear in those that would object to their lifestyle, and even without bringing in any type of evidence. And that's the same thing today. Even when we're talking about psychology and the different, and even right now in different institutions, you cannot dare to actually say this is not acceptable, and this is not part of human nature. This is not part of how God Almighty created reproduction to be like. This is not appropriate. Whatever things you try to prove it, the first thing that you're going to be accused of is that you're being homophobic. You're not being tolerant of other people's sexual orientation. Again, the word is orientation that is being put right there in order to proselytize this behavior as if it is more of a preference than anything else. إِنَّهُمْ أُنَاسٌ يَتَطَهَّرُونَ. They're people seeking purification. Now you're going to be labeled as such, that just because you might be seeking purification, seeking justice, that you're going to be labeled as bringing in phobia, bringing in fear, bringing in tolerance. You're not inclusive. And again, the word that is right now selling this behavior is the word inclusive. inclusive, which right now is really referring to one thing. I'll share one thing that happened. My kids go to Connections Academy, which is an online homeschooling, and I got this email. My daughter actually said, "Hey, Mom, look at this email that I got." What was that email about? The email was about a day of silence. So you assume, well, the day of silence, okay. I really thought that it was about George Floyd because of the timing that it was in. It was sent, I believe, 2 days ago. I opened up the email and turned out to be about what the LGBTQI plus, and I'm not sure what the rest of the letters are, but go through, and that it was supposed to be bring in a moment of silence in order to recognize what this group is going through. So I emailed them back and I said, I didn't want to straightforward because, they're not Muslim for me to actually use the Islamic evidences. So I said, they're not the only groups that are marginalized. They're not the only groups that are ostracized. I don't see anything talking about the African Americans. Even though George Floyd and what happened was just really recent. I don't see anything talking about the Asian community and what they're going through. I don't see anything talking about the Muslim community, not even the Jewish community. How come they don't get a day of silence? The response was, well, anyways, the LGBTQ are actually people from different races, from different religions, etc. So it becomes, therefore, we're being inclusive to every single one. Just imagine, it's like, so when somebody has that type of behavior, you could see that the focus is really on that particular group and how they want to engage in their, let's just call it private life, according to their understanding, right? Because in Islam, it's not just a private life. As long as you're doing it in private, the Islamic institution is not necessarily going to engage in any type of legal practice on you, unless you actually do it in public and it becomes a public behavior. That's when the law takes in. And the authorities take in, because then it is considered something that is harming the community, and then it is not anymore considered a private act. Right, but I just want to show you just an example of how this is right now indoctrinating even those that are deciding to be homeschooled. But it doesn't mean that I will leave homeschooling and put my kids in public school and say, well, even homeschoolers are right now facing this, so it's the same as public schools. No, it's not, because I still have, as the learning coach, I still have a lot of authority and a lot to do in educating my children on what really is happening. And that's the same thing in where, of course, the second that you approach this, you will be labeled in so many different ways. All right, let's move on. فَأَنْجَيْنَاهُ وَأَهْلَهُ. I want you to look at this fat right there. It's a beautiful fat. Why is it a beautiful fat? I want you to look at it. So remember, جواب قومه, and this is the second time within those ayat it says the word قومه. Let's go back and actually see it. Not really far from that ayat. Let's see it. So in the beginning, it said لقومه, and then قومه. What happened? And I emphasized it again. قومه. What happened? So you could see that he was really appalled at what they were doing. He was also part of that village. It was his family. When you say qawmihi, you're talking about somebody's family. You're talking about, this is supposed to be your support. This is supposed to be the people. These are supposed to be the people that you relate with as family from different dangers that surround you. But then when they took that initiative and said, expel them out of the country. Now, when you say expel them out of the village, you say expel them out, then you're leaving them to the different dangers that surround that country, whether we're talking about wild animals, whether we're talking about, different things that can happen in nature. But then that moment that they thought that by putting him or ostracizing him or putting him and expelling him out of the country, that they're actually going to be leaving him to lacking the security that he was once getting from his people, that's when that word fa, it didn't say wa. What's the difference? Why? That's why I called it a beautiful fa. The difference is, if it would say wa anjaynahu, that would mean there was a time lapse when that actual anjaynahu, the word anjaynahu would mean that he was saved. If it were to say wa anjaynah, that means there was a time lapse where he had to face himself, lacking security and feeling lost at one point, and then all of a sudden Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala's power or security comes in to save him. But that beautiful fa comes in and says right instantly. So that's what that beautiful fa is saying. That when his people had taken the initiative to ostracize him and expel him out of that country, right instantly, that's that letter fa. Secured not only him, but wa ahlahu, and his family. Why his family? Because his family was the only one to actually believe Prophet Lut alayhi salam and believe in Prophet Lut alayhi salam, except illa imra'atahu, which is actually really important to mention, because the word ahl is not exclusive to wife, but is exclusive to family. So that's one thing. The word ahl will include the wife as well. Why is that even important? Because Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala in Surah Al-Ahzab, لِيُذْهِبَ عَنْكُمُ الرِّجْسَ أَهْلَ الْبَيْتِ وَيُطَهِّرَكُمْ تَطْهِيرًا. Why is that important? Well, it's really important because when we say أهل البيت, لِيُذْهِبَ عَنْكُمُ الرِّجْسَ أهل البيت, when Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala was telling the Prophet sallam, لِيُذْهِبَ عَنْكُمْ, that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala was going to purify أهل البيت, the family of the Prophet sallam's family, that is to include not only the Hassan wal Hussein and Fatima and the Prophet ﷺ's grandchildren or children, but Ahl al-Bayt is to include the household of the Prophet ﷺ, the household of the Prophet ﷺ. In fact, that ayah, if you look at that ayah was actually in the context of talking to the wives of the Prophet ﷺ. Was actually in the context of talking to the wives of the Prophet ﷺ, meaning Ahl al-Bayt or Ahl al-Bayt includes the wives of the Prophet ﷺ, the wives of the Prophet ﷺ, and therefore when we look at Ahl al-Bayt and Ahl al-Bayt, respecting the wives of the Prophet ﷺ is actually part of respecting the Prophet ﷺ. Respecting al-Hassan and al-Hussein and Sayyidah Aysha is all part of respecting the Prophet ﷺ. Alright, what does that have to do with anything? Those that study Shi'ism understand what I'm talking about. فأنجيناه وأهله إلا امرأته كانت من الغابرين. So فأنجيناه وأهله, so he instantly was saved, was secured, right when his own people had isolated or had ostracized or expelled him and thought that they could put him to face the evils of the different things that may surround that village. So فَأَنْجَيْنَهُ, Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala instantly had saved him and his family except his wife. And when we look at his wife, so why his wife? Well, this is really important. When we look at the different stories of prophets, whether we're talking about Prophet Ibrahim alayhi salam, where he could not convince his father and he couldn't force him either. And when we look at Prophet Nuh alayhi salam, he couldn't force his own son. He couldn't force his own son to accept Islam. And when we look at Prophet Nuh and Prophet Lut, they both didn't have the power to force their wives into accepting Islam or accepting them as prophets. Why is that the case? Well, that's because there can't be, there in Islam there's no way that you can force anybody to accept Islam by force. Force is not an option whatsoever. It has to be something that comes from within. And that's why, subhanAllah, when we look at that, faith itself is actually something that is within. So even if the different forces will probably take away your Islam, nothing can take it away because it's on the inside. Same thing. Nobody can put it inside because it's on the inside. It's not on the outside. إِلَّا امْرَأَتَهُ كَانَتْ مِنَ الْغَابِرِينَ. So الغابرين, the word غابر, it actually comes from the root غَبَرَ. The word غَبَرَ would actually have several meanings. The number one, to dust and to remain. When we talk about why dust and remain, when you remain something for a long time, you keep something for a long time, it gets dusty, right? It gets dusty, and that the longer you keep it, the dustier it gets, and then the longer you keep it, of course, with the different laws of physics, or the thermodynamics, it basically makes it wear off, right? Makes it wear off. It starts losing a lot of the things in it, and it starts getting old, whether it gets rusty or different things. Anyhow, so كانت من الغابرين, here two things. غابرين means she was part of those that remained and were not غابرين, of course, were not, and was not one of those that were saved from his family and himself. And min al-ghabirin also means that she was one of those that remained. And remember what happened to the people of Prophet Lut alayhi salam. They were actually rained with rocks. They were rained with rocks, and they were also flipped upside down. The whole city was risen, and then it was flipped upside down. So why flipped upside down? Because they flipped truth. You flip truth, the result is going to be that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala is going to flip you yourself upside down. So that's why in Arabic we say al-jaza'u min jins al-amal. Al-jaza' min jins al-amal, which means that the punishment is going to be from the same type of action, from the same type of behavior. وَأَمْطَرْنَا عَلَيْهِمْ مَطَرًا. أَمْطَرْنَا عَلَيْهِمْ مَطَرًا. So not only, well, she remained, and she also was one of those people that got the matar, or that rain. And what type of rain was it? It was rain of rocks. They were rain of rocks. Is it necessarily rain of rocks, or is it kind of similar to what Pompeii had faced, in where we know the village in Italy, Pompeii, and how their sexual engagement was taking place, and then that volcano erupted and filled the place with all those ashes, and they eventually turned into stones. Is it something similar to that? Well, we don't have any evidence to prove that Pompeii was Qawm Lut, right? We don't have any evidence to prove that they were Qawm Lut, and we also don't have any evidence that that where Qawm Lut really were. We do know, though, that when we look at the Dead Sea, that it was actually called the Sea of Lut. Now, why was it called the Sea of Lut? It wasn't from a Quran base that it was called the Sea of Lut. That is the Dead Sea, and I went there many times. So it wasn't necessarily because people had, let me say, existing evidence to prove that Prophet Lut and his people were there. We don't have necessarily any evidence to prove that they were actually in Jericho, in Palestine, near the Dead Sea, and that's where it happened. We don't have any evidence that it was there. And even calling it Buhayrat Lut, or calling it the Sea of Prophet Lut alayhi salam, it wasn't based on evidence that we know of, or archaeological evidence. It was more of generations after generations that handed down this name. We don't really know when that name started. We don't know when that name started and how they began calling it and why they began calling it that name. So to actually specify that Prophet Lut alayhi salam was in Jericho or was not Pompeii, and they weren't in Pompeii, is really hard to use. And this is really important when we're talking about archaeological evidence to prove prophets and existing prophets. The evidences that in archaeology, the evidences that they use are totally different than the evidences that in the Quran might use or at least go back to why is that even important? Because somebody might say, well, what's the archaeological evidence that this prophet had existed or that prophet had existed? We don't necessarily say, well, the evidence that we don't find in the fossils or the artificial facts or the different things, the different remains in specific areas, we don't find their name being mentioned. Take a look, for example, at the pyramids. We don't find the name of Prophet Musa alayhi salam or Harun in the pyramids. So does that mean Prophet Musa alayhi salam didn't exist and only the pharaohs existed? So that's what we're talking about here, is that anyways the pharaohs did not perceive Prophet Musa alayhi salam of worth mentioning anyways. They didn't perceive that Prophet Musa alayhi salam of being a place of consideration because he was an enemy and not an ally. He was an enemy and not an ally. He was more perceived as a threat to that civilization. Do they necessarily have to mention every single thing that was considered a threat to that civilization? Well, absolutely not. So not being mentioned in those archaeological artifacts does not mean that they didn't exist. It just means that they were not mentioned. And not being mentioned is not an evidence that you were not there. All right, so that's a very important point to keep in mind. وَأَمْطَرْنَا عَلَيْهِمْ مَطَرًا. So they had this type of rain, and it's really important to mention that when we're looking at type of rain, is it a type of an eruption, or is it a type of really rain that was coming from the clouds? Because the word matar is anything that comes from above to below. So something that comes from above to below, so that may include a volcano eruption as well. I'm not saying, so please don't misunderstand me here and say that I said that there was a volcano eruption for Prophet or for the people of Lut. But we're saying that the word matar can include different things that are coming from up to down. In other words, it's basically raining upon somebody, and it doesn't have to be the actual rain that we know, the pouring rain, but it can be different substances that were coming down at them. فانظر كيف كان عاقبة المجرمين. فانظر كيف. And this is the word فانظر is really in order to motivate people to see based on the patterns of those that had for those that had attempted to deconstruct the construction that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala had put and created in this world, how Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala brings about their aqibah. Al-aqibah means the ending, the results, the conclusion of something. The result of a behavior, that is al-aqibah. So in other words, when a behavior takes place, the conclusion, and as a result of that particular behavior, that's where that punishment is going to come in. Now I want you to look at these ayat, just these ayat. I want to take you back to it, and let's now count again. So we already did three words here in where it called it al-fahisha. It also said ما سبقكم بها من أحد من العالمين, this is an unprecedented behavior, and it called it musrifun, where it is putting an effort in the wrong place. And then it continued to tell us that فأنجيناه وأهله, the word فأنجيناه is also giving us that sign that this was a destruction. فأنجيناه would mean that Prophet Lut alayhi salam was preserved, was saved from this destruction. In other words, they were not included in the preservation. They were not included in that safety. Why? Because of the destruction being specified and being directed at them. Now let's continue. كانت من الغابرين. The word says من الغابرين, that she was part of الغابرين, which is to include all those that had remained in that specific city, that they were, not only was she part of those that remained, but the word is really derogatory and really specifying that they too were remaining as a sign, as a sign as a lesson for those to later come to learn from their behavior and the result of their behavior and what had actually happened. وَأَمْطَرْنَا عَلَيْهِمْ مَطَرًا would also again say that there was a destruction, that it was coming to them from high above to bring them to lower grounds, to lower them, to make them equal to the ground and bring an end to their existence. فانظر كيف كان عاقبة. The word عاقبة, all those signs, by the way, in those ayat is really just to emphasize, especially during our times today, where we are right now seeing an imam LGBT, and we're seeing right now Muslims that are in support of this and calling it as being a new interpretation of the Quran, and said that Prophet Lut alayhi salam was telling people to stay away from al-fahisha, and said and claimed that it was referring to rape. Nothing more than these ayat can actually be so explicit in emphasizing and revealing that it was actually referring to a specific sexual act that they were doing, that is men engaging with men in those sexual acts. And the word is aqiba here in order to say that that was a result of that behavior. And then the word al-mujrimin was really referring, al-mujrimin, aqibat al-mujrimin was referring that that was a crime. The word mujrim, jarama, would mean to engage in an evil act. Now mujrim is an evil doer. Alright, and mujrim is an evil doer, and in other words, it was really emphasizing that it was actually a crime done against the laws that God Almighty had created in this world. What is the law that God Almighty created in this world? The laws of nature, let me correct that, not the laws of nature, but the laws that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala created in nature. Whether that was the law that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala put in reproduction, the law that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala put in mind and intellect, or whether that was the laws that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala had put in economy, which we will see in the laws of distribution with Prophet Tribe and what happened there. So you could see, although yes, we only did a couple of ayat, but I think it's really important, especially during the times that we're living in, with a lot of narratives being put forward, that a lot of the Muslims had actually fallen in this type of proselytizing such acts, and with the nice narratives that are being sold, and we're calling it inclusive, calling it tolerant, calling it orientation, calling it all these different terms. In Islam, it does not change the fact of that action is a type of destructing the laws that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala had created in nature in order to continue mankind's existence in their and of course the reproduction. So this is it for today. I'm sorry for being late today, but inshallah we'll continue next week hopefully, and make dua for me. I'm going through a little bit of a hard time now, so just make dua. May Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, Ya Rabbi, give us all good health, and give us inshallah the power to continue doing what we're doing, and may Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala bless the different things that we're doing, and may Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala always guide us to what is good for us and what is good for our children, and may Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala reward us for what we're doing, and may Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala always make our quwwah. We would always say Allahumma ta'ala, Ya Allah, give us give us the ability and the potentials for us to do the good in your sake. Allahumma ameen. Sister Yutundi, you had something to say. Go ahead. I believe you can unmute yourself, so that's good news. Go ahead, Sister Yutundi.
Assalamu alaikum.
Wa alaikum assalam wa rahmatullah.
Yeah, may Allah bless you and reward you for your time and make it easy on your affairs. I mean, Jazakumullah khairan.
Wa iyyakum.
Yeah, I don't have a question, but it's not related to the topic. It's just a question that somebody asked, and I kind of have an idea, but I need a scholarly support opinion about it. So, inshallah, if it's okay to ask.
You want to ask go ahead, you can ask a question.
Okay, yeah. So a sister was asking if when she's on a menstrual period, if she can read the Quran or something like that. Yeah.
So you mean when she has her period, whether she can read the Quran when she has her period, right?
Yes, or to Ramadan, reading the Quran and all of that.
Right. So I will answer the question in short, because it's a whole discussion, especially with somebody that is specialized in fiqh. I can go on and on in going with the evidences. To make the story short, there are differences of opinions relating to women reading Quran while they're on the cycle. Opinion number one is that they cannot read the Quran. That's the Shafi'i madhab. They cannot read the Quran while they're menstruating, not oral recitation, and not even holding the Quran. Opinion number one. And that is actually the most common, let me call it the majority of the different scholars that actually considered that opinion. Opinion number two is that she can read it orally but not hold the Quran. And the reason why they went into a bigger debate was really because of the ayah لا يمسه إلا المطهرون, as in Surah Al-Waqi'ah, that none shall touch it unless they're in a state of purification or a state of purity. Does that necessarily mean that anybody that is not in a state of wudu or a state of tahara from major and minor impurities? Major and minor impurities, in other words, major impurity requires a shower, such as janaba, such as after sexual or intimacy, and also after postpartum or after cycle, that requires a complete shower. All right, or whether it's a minor impurity that can be removed by making wudu. All right, so that is the second opinion. The second opinion regarded that she can read it orally, not holding the Quran, because of the ayah la yamassuhu illa al-mutahharun, and because of another hadith. That scholars actually had differences of opinions on whether it is authentic or not. Some scholars regarded it as authentic, which means that hadith that says that the Quran and the masjid, that the Prophet ﷺ does not permit it for somebody that is in a state of impurity, or state of impurity from cycle, or its state of impurity from intimacy. And this hadith, like I said, had differences of opinions. That's number one. Number two is that the other evidence that they used is that even though there are differences of opinions regarding that hadith, the different opinions on whether is a person in a state of a period the same thing as a person in a state of after intimacy, the state of after intimacy before taking a shower. So that analogy that they had used, there were different debates on whether you can use that type of analogy in purification and ritual, to be more specific. There were different debates on that. The other third opinion is that which is Ibn Hazm and other different scholars. And although it's really unfortunate that some scholars considered that this opinion was trying to seem moderate in the West, this is not trying to seem moderate in the West whatsoever. But this opinion is actually a considerable opinion that was taken by Ibn Hazm and other scholars, that regarded that whether reading the Quran orally or whether holding the Quran when the woman is in a state of having her period, or whether in a janaba. In a janaba, we'll discuss that later. Especially Ibn Hazm was pretty much the only one that regarded the janaba part, which is after intimacy. But let's focus on the period part. The period part, in where there are other scholars that disagreed and considered that she can hold the Quran and actually read it orally. And not necessarily like the Maliki or even Sa'id ibn al-Musayyib, who said only if she is teaching the Quran or if she is learning, so for educational purposes. The Ibn al-Musayyib, Sa'id al-Musayyib, and also al-Malikiyya regarded that only for education is she allowed to touch the Quran if she has her cycle. But like I said, this is not, when I personally take the opinion that that a woman during her cycle can touch the Quran and can read it orally, is not whatsoever in order to seem moderate. If I wanted to be moderate, I would have changed those ayat and changed the interpretation of those ayat to seem inclusive right in front of you. I don't think you can be as straightforward as much as I was today in actually saying this is not acceptable. So I will not whatsoever change hukum shar'i, change a ruling which I feel has evidence from Quran and Sunnah to prove something, just to seem inclusive or to seem moderate in the eyes of not a Westerner and not somebody that is living in the West or whatever it is. I will not change the rulings whatsoever. But the ruling that I consider preponderant is that a woman during her cycle can read the Quran and can touch the Quran, because the ayah لا يمسه إلا المطهرون, لا يمسه إلا المطهرون, one is the context of it is not necessarily straightforward that it's referring to the Quran. That's number one. Number two is that لا يمسه إلا المطهرون, لا يمسه إلا المطهرون. There were a lot of different debates on that, and during the time of the Prophet ﷺ, for sure, the wives of the Prophet ﷺ were having their cycles. Maybe not Salama and maybe not Sauda, but definitely the other wives were definitely having their cycles. Definitely so many women were coming and approaching to ask about the cycle, not a single hadith that is, let me call it, very authentic or authentic to speak about forbidding women from holding the Quran. To me is something where I would doubt, I would highly doubt if is strong enough to prove that women should not do this, is really making it to me making it to me is you cannot prove something haram unless there's evidence to support it. And I don't see any evidence to support that it is haram for a woman to hold the Quran or read the Quran during her cycle, especially that we know that every healthy woman passes this at least once every month, every 21 to 28 days. To not have a single hadith makes me skeptical of the ruling that she should not be touching the Quran. And not to mention that if we are to add on to that, where the Prophet ﷺ actually told us, Sayyidah Aysha, during Hajj time, if Ali ma yaf'aluhu al-Hajj ghayra an la tatufi bil bayt, do what a Hajj does, the person that is performing Hajj does, except don't do the tawaf, which is going around the Kaaba, غير أن لا تطوفي بالبيت. And what a Hajj does is istighfar, read the Quran, and he definitely made it clear that don't do tawaf, and he already had made it clear that a woman during her cycle does not fast and does not pray in many ahadith that are authentic. So why weren't there authentic and strong authentic ahadith to actually prevent women during their cycle from reading or holding the Quran? And to prevent women from reading and holding the Quran, if there is an authentic hadith, in the end, سمعنا وأطعنا. In the end, that's the end of the debate. That's the end of the discussion. سمعنا وأطعنا. In the end, that's it. That there's no way that I can debate this further if there is an authentic hadith. That's it. If there's a hadith to prove it, انتهى. But if the ahadith are not authentic enough, despite the fact that this is a monthly and a matter that every woman passes through, is really leaving me to say, based on that, to actually say, imagine if you are going to prevent women not only from salah, not only from siyam, not only from the masajid, but also prevent them from holding the Quran. Billahi, what is left of their Islam? What is left of a woman's Islam? What is left of a woman's dhikr? Unless, if I have an authentic hadith, سمعنا وأطعنا, I'll say, sisters, all you need to do is istighfar and do moments of dhikr in different ways outside the Quran. If I've got a hadith, انتهى. But if I don't have a hadith that is authentic and that doesn't have a debate on its level of authenticity, that's when I'm going to actually continue with saying, if there is no evidence, and I'm going to continue saying, well, if there's no evidence, don't take away a woman's Islam. Don't take away a woman's Islam by not letting her go to the masjid, by not letting her read the Quran, unless there's evidence. خلاص انتهى. But in the end, is that I consider the preponderant ruling is that yes, she can read the Quran while she's on her cycle. But we can't use the same argument and say, well, don't take away a woman's Islam and let her make her salah and let her make her siyam, because I've got evidence right there. And when we worship Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, we worship Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala the way He wanted us to worship Him. So if I would have an authentic hadith, I will just say سمعنا وأطعنا. I'll just say سمعنا وأطعنا. And may Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala guide us to al-haq. May Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala وَإِيَّاكُمْ. So sorry for the long answer, but I'm sure many sisters are really confused, especially in the month of Ramadan.
MashaAllah, barakallah feekum. Thank you so much. I appreciate it. Yeah, that has been what I understand I have heard before, but I was like, I'm not a scholar and I need to get something to support what I thought I've heard. For Jazakallah khairan. May Allah walk our shortcomings.
Ameen ya Rabbi. Alright, Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh, everyone. Jazakumullah khairan, and sorry for the long lecture. Sister Zubaydah unmuted herself. What do you want to say, Sister Zubaydah?
Assalamu alaikum.
Wa alaikum assalam wa rahmatullah.
I just wanted to add, so when I